Our first section is all about pie crust, and that is what I have in front of me, all of the things I need to make a perfect pie crust. I feel like this is the part that stresses everybody out the most, or at least it does for me, because I feel like this is the part of the pie that gets the most scrutiny. It has to be flaky, it has to be golden brown, it has to be crisp but not crunchy. It has to be all the things to everybody at the same time. But the thing with pie crust is you actually can really adjust it to your needs. So you basically have flour, fat, cold water, and then maybe a little bit of sugar, maybe some salt, but it basically comes down to the flour, fat, and water. That is what you're doing to make pie crust. And the fat is really the linchpin here. So I usually make a butter crust, and I'm an advocate for a butter crust because butter tastes fantastic. And the way butter works is essentially it does make things tender and crisp to a degree, but it also makes it really flaky. And that's what I like about the pie crust with butter. The reason why it makes it flaky is because when you bake butter in the oven, it actually separates and the water evaporates. And so the evaporation process, that is what causes that tenderness and that flakiness, because the water kind of pushes through the flour, creating all of these awesome layers. So that's why it tastes so good. All right, well, I'm gonna get started on making my butter crust, and I'm gonna use my hands. You can easily do this in any kind of food processor. Just make sure you're pulsing it rather than just like watching it go the entire time, because then you're gonna overwork the dough. But if you're doing it by hand, it's actually pretty hard to overwork the dough. I think, hands just tend to be a little more delicate. So what I have here is enough for 2 pie crusts. So if I'm making a double pie, I will have plenty. Also, just for what it's worth, I tend to kind of make a little too much pie dough because I'd rather have a little too much than not quite enough. That's the worst when you're rolling it out and you're just like a 1/4 inch shy. So this is probably more than enough. If you wanted to diminish this by like 30%, you'd be totally fine. So what I have here is 3 3/4 cup of all-purpose flour. I have 12 ounces of butter, and I've basically just sort of chopped them up into little pieces, and this is ice cold. I actually have this straight from the freezer. I put it in the freezer for a few minutes just to get it really nice and cold. I have about a 1/2 cup of cold ice water. I have 4.5 tablespoons of sugar, and then I have 1.5 teaspoons of kosher salt. So here's the technique to making pie crust by hand. And this is the same whether you're doing a butter crust, lard, whatever. So I'm gonna first mix together my dry ingredients. So in goes the salt, in goes the sugar, and then in go my hands. So I'm just gonna loosely mix this together. I want everything to be really well integrated because you just don't wanna get a pocket of anything. You don't wanna get a pocket of sugar or a pocket of salt. So just going through a couple of times will really do the trick. There we go. Next, I'm gonna add the butter, and you can add them little by little. I kind of tend to add quite a bit at once. So what I'm going to do is with my fingertips, I'm taking butter and the flour and I'm just squishing it together like this. But I'm doing it really quickly and just kind of rubbing. And the reason why I'm rubbing with my fingertips versus using the palms of my hands is because if I use the palms of my hands, it actually melts the butter too quickly. What I'm looking for is for it to feel very moist, almost like wet sand, and for it to be kind of shaggy looking. So now I'm gonna add the water. And this is another big key point. You do not wanna add too much because this is the thing, everything's perfectly ratioed out. So you can always add a little more water if you need to, but you can't add more flour if you add too much water. So it's better to be a little conservative and do just a couple tablespoons at a time. The reason why it's not the same amount every time is because the weather and your house, what the kitchen's like, all of those atmospheric things can really affect how the flour absorbs it. If it's a really dry day, you might need to use more water. If it's a really wet day, you might need to use a little bit less. And so what I'm looking for, I'm just kind of lightly putting it together, waiting to see if it actually is gonna come together, because you want to start loosely forming a dough at this point. So I'm gonna add a few more tablespoons of water. Very nice. And I have 2 pieces of plastic wrap here. You can also use parchment paper if you'd rather, but I like plastic wrap because it gets all the way around the dough. They're pretty long pieces, and you'll see why in a moment. I let the dough rest in the fridge for, I'd say, about 30 minutes. Also, putting it back in the fridge, it allows everything to get its chill back. So that means it's not going to melt into a giant mess in the oven. So I use the plastic wrap to kind of just squish it all together. You just want to create a nice little ball. And then I fold the plastic wrap over. So I'm gonna leave a little bit of extra plastic wrap right here. little gap because I'm now pressing down the dough and I want to give it space. So the reason why I'm pressing it down now, it just makes it a lot easier after this is chilled in the fridge to roll it out. And I'm now going to do the exact same thing with the other dough. So the doughs are done, so I'm going to pop them in the fridge for about 30 minutes just until they set.